David never thought his life would turn in such a strange way, because when he first stepped into the ship, he was just another worker who cleaned the floors and carried the crates from one end of the cargo hold to the other, and he always believed that he would remain invisible to the crew because humans were not important in the eyes of the great alien travelers who sailed between the stars. But one day, as he walked too close to the Navigator section, the alarms rang and the heavy silver doors sealed shut behind him, and he suddenly found himself standing in a glowing room, filled with strange lights and moving patterns across the walls, and he realized with a shock that this was the cabin of the Navigator, and no one was allowed to be here except the one who guided the ship through the endless void of the galaxy. The silence in the room was heavy, like a weight pressing on his chest. And then he saw her standing in the center beside a long curved table of crystal that glowed with symbols that made no sense to his eyes, and she looked at him with calm eyes that carried no fear and no anger, but something different, and she spoke in a soft tone that almost felt like a whisper inside his head, and she said, "It is just the two of us now." And when David heard those words, his heart beat faster because he knew something was wrong, and he knew he was not supposed to be here. And yet there was no way back, since the door was locked by some strange power that he could not even begin to understand. He tried to press his hand against the panel near the door, but nothing moved and no sound answered his push, and the alien Navigator watched him with quiet patience and then told him that once the cabin is sealed, it cannot be opened until the jump is complete, and that meant hours or maybe days of waiting together inside this small chamber of light and silence. And David felt trapped like an insect in a jar, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The room itself felt alive with gentle humming, as if the walls breathed with hidden energy, and every surface shifted with faint light like stars floating in liquid. And David stared around him, unable to tell what was real and what was only an illusion, and his fear grew stronger because he realized he was cut off from everyone else on the ship, and he was trapped with a being he did not know and could not trust. Alien Navigator introduced herself only as Lyra, and her voice was calm like flowing water, yet her presence was strange and unearthly. Her skin carried a pale glow like moonlight, and her eyes reflected shifting constellations, as if the stars themselves lived within her gaze, and David felt small and unworthy in front of her, as if she was part of the universe itself while he was just a human from a forgotten world. But still he stood his ground, because fear and survival made him stubborn. Lyra told him that the cabin was the heart of the ship, and once sealed, no one could leave until the path through space was charted and secure. And David asked why it was only her inside, when such a task seemed too large for one being, and she simply replied that a navigator does not need company, and that the ship itself listens to her commands and bends the stars to her will. And those words made David feel even more uneasy, because he did not know if she spoke the truth or if she only wished to keep him afraid and quiet. As the minutes stretched into hours, David walked along the edge of the room, searching for any weakness in the walls, any chance to force the door open. But there was none, and each time he turned back, Lyra was still watching him, her eyes calm, her face unreadable, and her voice never rising above a whisper inside his thoughts. And she told him again that it is just the two of us, and David began to wonder if those words were meant as comfort or as a warning. His mind returned again and again to the idea of being forgotten here, because if no one could open the door, then what if the crew never came for him? What if he was trapped forever in this glowing chamber, with only the alien Navigator for company? And what if her calm face hid secrets darker than the void outside the ship? The silence grew thicker the longer he stayed, and every sound he made felt too loud. The shuffle of his boots, the heavy beat of his heart, the sound of his breath echoing against the strange walls. And all the while, Lyra continued to trace patterns across the crystal table, her fingers leaving trails of light that curved and twisted like rivers of stars. And David thought she looked like someone painting reality itself. At one point he asked her why she said it was only the two of them, and she lifted her head and replied, "That once the cabin is sealed, no other life can reach them, not friend, not enemy, not even the captain of the ship, and that this place was now beyond the reach of all others." And David felt a chill deep in his bones, because he realized that he was cut off not only by walls, but by forces far greater than he could ever fight. Still, he did not give up hope, because hope was the only weapon. He had left, and he kept telling himself that when the jump ended, the door would open and he would be free. But deep inside, a small whisper of doubt kept growing. What if she was lying? What if the cabin never opened? What if she had chosen him for some reason he could not yet see? And so David stood in the glowing room, trapped with the alien Navigator. While time stretched thin and uncertain, and her voice kept returning in his head, "It is just the two of us." And every time he heard it, the words felt heavier, like chains wrapping around his mind, and his heart beat faster because he knew this was only the beginning of something far stranger than he could ever imagine. The cabin felt like a prison to David, and every second stretched like a heavy chain pulling his thoughts deeper into fear and doubt, and he kept walking from one wall to another, pressing his palms against the strange surfaces that pulsed like the skin of some living creature. Yet no opening appeared, and no sound answered his struggle, and he turned back to face Lyra, who still stood beside the glowing table of light, tracing patterns that looked like rivers of fire in the sky. And she spoke again, in that calm whisper that seemed to slide straight into his head, without passing through the air, and she told him there is no escape until the journey is complete, and that he should rest because the cabin will not open before its time. David did not believe her completely, because trust was not easy when you were trapped with someone you did not know, especially someone who was not human, and he felt her eyes always following him, not with anger or hate, but with a stillness that was almost worse, because it was impossible to read her thoughts, and he could not tell if she saw him as a threat or as nothing more than a fragile creature caught in her world by accident. And that made his skin crawl, because being invisible was safer than being noticed, and now he was noticed in a way he could not escape. Hours seemed to pass, though time was impossible to measure in that room, because the walls glowed with steady light that never dimmed, and the hum of the ship was constant, like the slow breathing of a giant creature asleep in the dark. And David sat down finally against the cold wall, his body heavy with exhaustion, and he asked Lyra what she meant when she first said, "It is just the two of us," and she answered without looking away from her patterns, that when the cabin is sealed, the Navigator and the one who shares the seal are cut off from all others, and in that moment their fates are joined until the path through the void is secure. And David felt his heart twist, because her words sounded like a vow and a sentence both at once. He wanted to know why fate had chosen him of all people, a simple worker who carried crates and swept dust from the floors, and he asked her if she had done this on purpose, if she had called him into the cabin for some reason. And Lyra turned her head slowly and looked at him with eyes that shimmered like liquid stars. And she said, "No, I did not call you, and yet you are here, and that means you were meant to be here, and that is how the universe writes its paths." And those words filled David with a new unease, because he did not believe in destiny, yet the way she spoke made it sound like something stronger than belief. The silence after her words pressed hard on him, and he thought about the crew outside, and whether they even knew he was trapped inside the cabin, and he imagined them carrying on with their work, laughing and talking, while he sat in this glowing room, cut off from everything familiar, and his chest grew tight with anger and fear, because he did not want to be forgotten. He did not want to vanish into silence like so many humans who were lost among the stars and never remembered again. Lyra must have felt his fear, because she spoke again, saying that the cabin is safe, and that no harm can come to them while the seal is closed. And David almost laughed, though the sound stuck in his throat, because safety felt like another kind of prison, and he wondered if she even understood what fear was, because her voice never shook and her face never changed, and she seemed more like a statue of living light than a being who felt the same hunger and weakness that weighed on him. At one point he asked her how long until the seal opened, and she told him it would depend on the path and the signals beyond the ship, and David leaned forward asking what signals, and she raised her hand over the crystal table, and the patterns shifted and spread into wide streams of light showing distant shadows moving across the dark, and she explained that other ships hunted in the void, searching for prey, and that the path must be hidden and shielded, or they would be caught and destroyed. And David felt his breath catch because he realized that he was not only trapped, he was trapped in the middle of danger that reached beyond anything he had ever imagined. The lights on the table grew darker then brighter, as if reacting to storms unseen, and Lyra traced her fingers through them with calm skill, shaping the lines into safer paths while she told him that the hunters were ruthless and that her duty was to keep the ship alive no matter the cost. And David asked her what she meant by cost, but she did not answer, only looked at him with those shifting eyes, and then turned back to her task, as if the answer was too heavy for words. The longer David stayed inside the cabin, the more he noticed how strange the space felt, because the walls seemed to move when he did, shifting with faint ripples like water disturbed by invisible currents, and sometimes he thought he heard faint whispers echoing inside the hum of the ship, words too soft to understand yet heavy with meaning. And when he asked Lyra about them, she only said, "The ship listens," and David wished she had not said that, because the thought of the ship itself listening to him made the room feel smaller and tighter, and his fear grew sharper. To pass the time he asked Lyra about her people, and at first she did not speak, but later she told him that navigators are born with eyes that see the hidden currents of the void, and that their duty is to guide their kind safely across the endless dark. And when he asked if she was alone, she said, "Yes, always, because the navigator must stand apart and cannot share the burden with others." And David felt a strange ache at her words, because he knew what loneliness felt like, though his was small compared to hers. And in that moment, for the first time, he looked at her not only as a strange alien being, but as someone trapped in her own way, just like him. The silence between them softened after that, though the fear never left, and sometimes he caught her looking at him not with suspicion, but with something almost like curiosity, as if she too was trying to understand what it meant to share the cabin with a creature so different from herself. And David wondered if this strange bond was only temporary, or if it was the start of something he could not yet see. Still, the danger outside was real, and the strange signals on the table grew more urgent with each passing cycle of light, and Lyra worked faster, her fingers moving like flowing water across the glowing surface, and David felt his heart pound because he sensed that whatever hunted them was drawing closer, and that his time in the cabin was not just about waiting for the door to open, but about facing something far more terrifying than loneliness. And he could not escape the thought that maybe her words were true, and that fate had placed him here for a reason. He would soon discover, and so the hours stretched long and heavy inside the sealed chamber where the human and the alien navigator shared their uneasy coexistence, their breaths and their fears mixing in silence, while the void outside stirred with unseen threats, and every moment felt like the calm before a storm that would soon decide whether they lived or vanished into the endless night. David sat against the wall, staring at the shifting streams of light across the crystal table, and his chest grew tighter with each passing moment, because the signals on the display were no longer soft glows but sharp movements like claws scraping across the void. And Lyra stood tense, though her face never changed, her fingers flying faster over the glowing surface, as if she was holding back a storm. And finally she spoke, saying, "They are close now," and her words filled David with a cold fear that spread through his body like ice, because he knew without asking that she was talking about the hunters. He rose to his feet, his voice heavy and shaking, as he asked what she meant, and Lyra turned to him, her eyes filled with shimmering constellations that shifted like restless waves, and she said that raiders moved in the darkness, waiting to tear apart any ship they found, and that her people had been hunted for generations by these shadows who lived on destruction and greed. And David felt his throat dry because he had heard stories of raiders before, though never this close, and never from the lips of someone who was staring straight into their approach. The humming of the cabin grew louder, as if the ship itself felt the danger, and the walls pulsed with faster light, and David pressed his palms against the surface, trying to steady himself, but the walls seemed alive like the skin of some giant beast, and he felt sick with the thought that they were floating helpless in an endless ocean of darkness, while unseen predators circled nearer with every passing breath. Lyra moved her hand in wide arcs across the table, her voice calm yet edged with urgency, as she explained that the raiders use strange machines to sense the trails of energy left by ships, and that only a skilled navigator could hide those trails by weaving a path through hidden channels in the void. But this time the hunters were closer than she had ever felt before, and the cabin trembled faintly, as if even the ship knew what was coming. And David realized with horror that he was not just trapped in an alien room, he was caught inside the heart of a battle he never chose. He asked her if the ship had weapons, if the crew could fight, but Lyra shook her head slowly and said the raiders were too many and too ruthless, and that the only way to survive was to run deeper into the hidden paths where even the strongest enemy could not follow. And David asked if she could do that alone, and for the first time he saw her hesitate, her glowing hands pausing above the table, her voice softer as she admitted that the path was heavier than one mind could bear, and that she needed a second presence to anchor the jump. And David felt his chest tighten because he understood what she meant. She was asking him to help. At first, he wanted to refuse because he was just a human worker with no skill in alien navigation and no place at a table that shaped the stars. But Lyra looked at him with eyes that held both calm and weariness, and she said that the cabin chose him when it sealed, and that meant he was bound to her until the journey was safe. And those words cut through his fear like a blade, because if that was true, then his choice was already made, and he had to decide whether to sit in fear or to stand and face the storm with her. He moved closer to the table, staring at the streams of light that twisted and curved like rivers of fire, and he said he did not understand, and she told him that he did not need to understand, only to trust the rhythm of his mind and his instinct, because the paths of the void were alive, and they listened not only to knowledge but to will and to heart. And David felt his pulse pounding faster because he had never trusted his will for anything greater than carrying crates. Yet now she asked him to use it to save them both. The ship shook suddenly, with a deep echo that rattled through the cabin, and the lights on the walls flared brighter, and Lyra said, "They have found us." And David felt the fear turn his stomach cold, but he placed his hands on the table beside hers, and the surface burned like warm fire beneath his skin, and the streams of light shifted around his fingers, as if welcoming his touch, and he gasped because he felt something stir inside his mind, a strange pull like invisible currents wrapping around him. Lyra's voice entered his head, clear and steady, telling him to follow the flow, to let it guide him, not to fight. And he tried, though fear clawed at his chest and sweat ran down his face. But the light, the beat beneath his hand like water under the weight of a stone, and he realized he could move it not with strength, but with thought and instinct. And as he pushed, the flow bent into a new curve, and Lyra's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope, and she said, "Yes." Like that, outside the cabin the ship trembled again, as if struck by unseen claws, and the humming grew louder, and David almost pulled his hands away, but Lyra placed hers over his, holding them firm, and she whispered that if he stopped now they would both die, and her words cut through his panic, and he steadied himself, focusing again on the rivers of light, and together their hands moved across the glowing surface, bending the streams into hidden tunnels of shadow and fire. The signals of the hunters flared sharp on the table, like knives piercing the void, and David's chest tightened as they drew closer, but Lyra's voice steadied him, telling him to trust and to push forward, and he did, and suddenly the light opened before them into a wide path like a tunnel of stars, hidden deep inside The dark in the ship surged forward with a heavy lurch that almost threw him to the floor. But Lyra kept his hands steady, and their eyes locked for a moment, and in that silent look, David saw not only alien calm, but something almost human, almost fragile like gratitude. The cabin grew darker as the hunters' signals flickered at the edge of the table, their claws unable to pierce the path they had chosen, and David gasped with relief, though the strain burned through his body like fire, and he asked her if they were safe now, and Lyra shook her head, her voice soft but firm, saying, "Not yet," because the hunters would not give up so easily, and the path ahead was long and dangerous, and without his help she could not keep it stable. David wanted to tell her he was afraid that he was not strong enough, but the words died in his throat, because he saw the weariness in her glowing eyes, and he realized that she was carrying this burden alone for all her life, and now for the first time she was not alone, and he knew he could not abandon her to that silence, not now, not ever. And so David kept his hands on the table, the rivers of light burning under his touch, while the void outside stirred with shadows waiting to strike again, and Lyra stood beside him, calm, yet no longer alone, and together they faced the hidden threat that grew sharper with each passing moment, and though fear still gripped his heart, he felt a strange spark inside him, something close to courage, and he knew this was only the beginning of a fight far greater than he had ever imagined. Cabin trembled as if the ship itself was alive, and David could feel the vibrations under his feet, the hum of power surrounding them growing stronger, and the streams of light across the crystal table twisted and shifted faster than ever before, and Lyra's fingers flew over the surface, her eyes steady, yet sharp like the edge of a blade, as she traced hidden paths through the void, and David stood beside her, heart pounding in his chest, because the danger they faced was no longer distant, it was close enough to touch, and yet he felt a strange pull inside him, a mix of fear and courage that made his hands itch to move across the glowing lines. Lyra spoke softly, telling him to follow the flow, to trust his instinct, and David reached forward, placing his palms on the table, and the streams of light bent beneath him like water under a gentle current, and he gasped as the connection grew stronger, and he realized that the cabin had chosen him not to be a prisoner, but to be a partner in a task far beyond what any human had ever done, and the realization made his pulse race and his mind sharpen at the same time, because the responsibility was terrifying and thrilling all at once. The signals of the raiders flared red across the table like claws striking from the dark, and Lyra whispered that they had little time, that the outer defenses of the ship were failing, and David's hands shook as he tried to bend the streams of light faster, and the cabin seemed to pulse with urgency, as if it understood that failure would mean death, and that the weight of survival rested on two unlikely beings alone in a sealed room, far from the safety of the crew. He glanced at Lyra for a moment, and saw the strain hidden behind her calm face, the tightness in her shoulders, the subtle tremor in her fingers as she guided him through the impossible navigation, and he felt a strange surge of protectiveness, because she was so powerful, yet so human in her need for help, and he knew that the only way they would survive was if he gave himself fully to the task and let instinct and fear and courage merge into one continuous flow of movement and thought. Outside the cabin, the ship shuddered as if struck by unseen forces. The lights flickered and the hum grew into a roar as the raiders struck at their shields with weapons beyond comprehension, and David could feel the vibrations shake his bones, and he realized that every second counted, that one mistake could end them both. And yet Lyra's presence beside him gave him a strange calmness, a sense that they were not alone in this fight, that together they could bend the currents of the void and escape the predators closing in from all sides. He moved his hands faster, following the invisible rhythms of the cabin, the rivers of light bending beneath his touch, forming curves and tunnels that twisted and shielded the ship, and he could feel Lyra guiding him with silent cues, a tilt of her wrist, a shift of her gaze, a quiet hum in her mind, and the coordination felt natural. despite its impossibility, and for a moment he forgot fear and only felt the thrill of connection and the pulse of the ship beneath him, and he knew that this was what it meant to be alive among the stars. The raiders flared closer, the signals jumping sharply across the table like fire spreading in the night, and Lyra spoke clearly for the first time, telling him that the final jump could only be made if he kept the flow steady and the cabin synchronized, and that once they launched there would be no turning back. And David swallowed the lump in his throat, because he understood that this was a choice between survival and death, between fear and courage, and he felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest like a mountain made of glass. He hesitated for a heartbeat, thinking of what could go wrong, and then Lyra placed her hand over his, holding him steady, and she said, "Do not stop now, trust yourself, trust the cabin, trust us." And the touch sent a spark through him, a confidence he did not know he possessed, and he realized that this was no longer just about waiting to survive. It was about stepping forward into something impossible and making it real with nothing but instinct and will and heart. The lights twisted faster, the table pulsing with rivers of energy that moved beneath their hands like living things, and David could feel every signal, every vibration of the ship, every pull of the currents, and he understood for the first time what Lyra meant when she said a navigator needed a second mind, a second heart to guide the path through the void, because together they moved faster, stronger, more precise than either could have done alone. And the realization filled him with a mixture of awe and fear, because the responsibility was immense, and yet the power was intoxicating. At one moment the signals of the raiders spiked sharply, like claws striking toward the ship, and David flinched, and Lyra's voice cut through the panic, telling him to steady the flow, to push the currents into the hidden path, and he obeyed, feeling a surge of energy run from his hands into the streams of light, and the table pulsed, responding to their combined will, and the ship shuddered violently as if the void itself was testing their courage and skill, and yet they did not falter. Minutes stretched like hours as they worked together, moving in perfect coordination, bending the light, twisting the currents, shaping the paths of the ship through hidden tunnels in the darkness. And David felt his muscles ache, his mind strain, yet he could not stop because every second mattered, and he saw Lyra's calm face beside him, her eyes glowing with intensity, and in that moment he understood that trust was not given, it was earned, and that they had earned it through shared danger and shared focus and shared survival. Finally, the signal of the hunters began to fade at the edges of the table, like shadows pulled back by unseen hands, and David's hands burned with exertion, but he kept them on the surface because he knew the jump was coming. He could feel it vibrating through the cabin, and Lyra's voice whispered, "Do not let go. Now the jump is near." And he took a deep breath, forcing his fear down into determination, and the streams of light bent into a tunnel wider and brighter than before, stretching before them into the darkness like a promise of safety. He glanced at Lyra and saw her nod slightly, a small motion, but full of weight, and he understood that she trusted him fully. And he felt a surge of pride and fear all at once, because the final jump required every ounce of focus and energy, and he realized he could not stop until the path was fully formed, until the currents of the void bent beneath their will, and the cabin hummed in agreement, and together they would take the impossible leap through the stars. The ship shuddered again, the lights on the walls flaring as if preparing for the launch, and David felt his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the cabin, and he tightened his hands on the table, pushing the currents forward, guiding the rivers of light into the final alignment. And Lyra leaned slightly closer, her presence steadying him, and he understood that they were no longer teacher and student, or human and alien, but two beings bound by necessity, courage and trust, moving as one toward the impossible choice that would decide life or death. In that moment, David felt a strange calm settle over him, a clarity that made every fear shrink into insignificance, because he realized that he was ready to take the leap, to trust himself, to trust Lyra, and to trust the cabin, and together they would face whatever lay ahead in the void, and maybe, just maybe, survive what no one had ever survived before. David felt the currents of the cabin flowing beneath his hands, the rivers of light bending and twisting as if alive, and Lyra stood beside him, her eyes reflecting the glow of 1,000 stars as she whispered, "Do not stop." Now, and he focused every ounce of energy, every beat of his heart, and every thought into the motion of the streams, feeling them respond to his will as the ship shuddered under the weight of approaching danger, and the signals of the hunters flared like fire on the edges of the table, testing their every movement, and David felt the fear in his chest spike like lightning striking deep inside him, but he did not pull back because he knew this was the moment that would decide everything. The cabin hummed louder as the currents shifted faster, and Lyra guided him silently through gestures subtle and precise, and David followed instinct, trusting the pulse of the light, the rhythm of the cabin, and the strange connection growing between them. And as they worked together, the streams of energy began to form a perfect tunnel through the void, a hidden path that would carry the ship beyond the reach of their pursuers. And his muscles ached, his mind burned, but he did not stop because survival demanded focus and courage, and the bond between them had grown into something stronger than fear. Outside the ship, the darkness pulsed with motion, the hunters closing in, relentless and ruthless, and David could feel their presence even through the hum of the cabin, as if the void itself pressed against them, testing their will. And he realized that every choice he had made, every step he had taken, had led to this instant where human instinct and alien knowledge met in a single purpose, and the weight of it almost crushed him. But he drew a deep breath, letting the fear flow into determination, and letting the currents guide him as if they were part of him, and he was part of them. Lyra spoke softly, telling him that the jump would require perfect synchronization, that one lapse could destroy them both. And David nodded, though his throat was dry, because he understood completely that he was no longer a passive participant. He was a partner in the navigation of the stars, and the thought made his pulse race with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, and for the first time he felt that he belonged to something far greater than his own small human life. The streams of light glowed brighter, bending into the shape of a tunnel wide and solid enough to carry the ship through the void unseen, and David moved his hands with careful precision, matching Lyra's gestures and timing each motion with instinct born of fear and trust. And he could feel the ship responding, pulsing with energy that seemed alive and conscious. And Lyra placed her hand gently over his for a moment, and he felt warmth and calm flow through him like water quelling a storm, and he realized that whatever came next, they would face it together. The signals of the hunters flared violently at the edges of the display, the claws of pursuit striking toward the ship, but the hidden path held steady, twisting around them, shielding the vessel as if the void itself had chosen to protect them. And David could not help the shout of relief that escaped him, even as his body shook from exhaustion, and Lyra's eyes met his with a faint smile for the first time, and in that look he understood gratitude and trust and connection deeper than words could ever carry. The cabin seemed to pulse with energy as the final alignment came into place, the rivers of light converging into a single arc stretching into the darkness, and David could feel the pull of the jump tugging at his mind and soul, as if asking him to let go of fear, to let go of doubt, to leap into the unknown. And he hesitated for a heartbeat, thinking of what might happen, what could go wrong, what could be lost. And then he felt Lyra's hand steady over his, guiding him, and he whispered, "Yes, we can do this together." And that was enough to tip the scales. With a sudden surge, the cabin erupted with light and vibration, the ship lurching as the hidden tunnel bent reality around them, carrying the vessel through currents invisible and impossible. And David felt the sensation of flying without air, without ground, without limits, as the stars stretched and blurred around them, and he held onto the currents, to Lyra, to the pulse of the cabin, and for a long moment it felt as if time itself had stopped, and then a calm descended like a wave spreading over the void. When the light faded and the hum returned to its steady rhythm, David sank to the floor, his body trembling with relief and wonder, and Lyra stood beside him steady and glowing softly, her eyes reflecting the tunnels of light they had created, and she whispered, "It is done. It is finally done." And David nodded, though words failed him, because he understood fully that they had survived against impossible odds, that they had faced the hunters and bent the stars to their will, and that the cabin had not been a trap, it had been a test. And they had passed. The door of the cabin slid open, slowly revealing the corridor beyond, and David felt the sunlight of the ship's outer decks wash over him, though it was not sunlight, but the glow of engines and lights, and he stepped out with a sense of awe, because he was no longer just a human worker. He was someone who had helped guide a ship through the impossible. He had stood beside an alien navigator and faced death and fear, and come through it, alive and stronger, and Lyra followed him, her hand brushing his briefly in a silent gesture of respect and connection. No one outside the cabin had seen what had happened. No one could know the terror, the stakes, the silent partnership that had carried them through, and David felt a quiet pride that no words could capture, and he realized that humanity was not weak or fragile. It was capable of instinct, courage, and creativity beyond measure when tested. And he glanced at Lyra, and she smiled faintly and repeated softly, "It was just the two of us." And this time the words did not sound like a warning, but like a promise, a bond formed in the heart of the void. The crew would continue with their tasks, unaware that a human had become part of something far greater than any of them had imagined. And David felt a strange peace settling over him, because the fear that had once consumed him had been replaced with purpose and strength, and he knew that wherever the ship went next, he would face it with calm and courage, because he had learned that trust and instinct and heart could bend the universe itself when needed. And so the ship sailed on through the endless stars, carrying David and Lyra safely through hidden paths beyond the reach of hunters and danger. And in the quiet after the storm, the human looked at the alien navigator and realized that the journey had changed him forever, that fear had been replaced with trust and courage, that the impossible had become possible, and that together they had become more than the sum of their parts. And the cabin was no longer a prison. It was a place of awakening, a place of connection, a place where two beings had faced the void and survived. As the lights dimmed to their gentle glow and the hum of the ship settled into a steady rhythm, David felt a soft echo in his mind, her words repeating, and he smiled because he understood fully that this time it was true. It was just the two of us, and that was enough to face any darkness, any danger, any impossible path ahead. And with that, he knew the story of this journey was complete, and the stars themselves seemed to shine brighter in recognition of what they had achieved together. The end.